and the slides afterwards. All right. So welcome. This is the Virginia Energy Efficiency Council's Building Performance Roundtable. My name is Jessica Green. I'm the Outreach Director at the VAEC. Today's event will be focused on the building performance mandates for local governments and public schools. We'll be holding a second roundtable tomorrow, which will focus on the mandates for state agencies. So before we get started, I just want to share a quick slide about who we are for those who are not familiar with us. The Virginia Energy Efficiency Council is a nonprofit membership-based organization, which includes Fortune 500 companies, state agencies, municipalities, nonprofits, and more. We engage our members to identify barriers to and opportunities for energy efficiency advancement and to develop a strong fact-based and balanced industry voice before policymakers and regulators. If you're unfamiliar with us and our work, I recommend visiting our website. And then second, I just want to draw your attention to the chat box. Feel free to submit any questions or comments here throughout the event. We'll also be self-selecting into breakout rooms later on to give everyone a chance to ask their questions. We very much want this to be a place where you're not only presented with information pertaining to Virginia's building performance law, but we want this to be an interactive session where you get to voice your questions, concerns, and comments. Here's our agenda for today. We have a couple of experts joining us who will be giving a presentation on just different green building terminology, the legislation overview, and the 3 pathways to compliance. We'll have a couple of polls interspersed throughout just to get to know our audience a bit better before we jump into breakout rooms where there'll be facilitated discussions based on different topics. So we're incredibly fortunate to be joined by VAEC board members Elizabeth Beardsley, Brenna Dunn, and Maggie Kelly-Riggins. Liz is Senior Policy Counsel at the U.S. Green Building Council. Her portfolio includes federal, state, and local green building law and policy issues. Recently, her work has focused on connecting building policy to climate mitigation, and she represents USGBC at the UNFCCC climate change conferences. She came to USGBC from the U.S. Government Accountability Office, where she was a senior attorney involved in evaluating government, environment, and energy programs. Brenna is Vice President, serving as the Director of Sustainability Planning for Mosley Architects. She works with project teams for the early planning through building construction to ensure that the most energy efficient and environmentally responsible solutions are considered and implemented where feasible. She has over 100 LEED certified projects in her portfolio. She's a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners, an associate member of the American Institute of Architects, and is a LEED fellow. She served for 8 years as the chair for the U.S. Green Building Council Sustainability Site Technology Advisory Group and 6 years in the LEED Steering Committee, including serving as both vice chair and chair. And then we'll also have Maggie on for any questions that she can address. Maggie serves as the Southeast Energy Efficiency Alliance's Built Environment Project Manager and has held this position since 2019 after serving as SEIA's first Emerging Leader Fellow. She got her start at the Policy Analyst at the City of Brookhaven, where she focused on sustainability and energy, the transportation projects, and internal policies. Her current charge is to support energy efficiency building work in the Southeast, connecting and engaging with projects that will push energy efficiency forward in the region. I'm now going to turn things over to you, Liz, for an overview of green building terms and HB 2001. And then Brenna will follow with a deeper dive into the 3 pathways for compliance.
Great, thank you, Jessica. And you can start the slides whenever you have a chance. I'm Liz Beardsley again. Pleased to join this event today, and to USGBC is a mission-based organization. Our vision is a world where buildings and communities sustain the vitality of all life. And then our mission is to transform buildings and communities to support people and planet. And we partner with the VAEEC on numerous things. I've been honored to be on the board of directors and to work closely with the council and members on various policy initiatives and legislation, which brings us to today's topic.
Yep, and sorry to interject real quick, Liz, before we jump into that, I wanted to launch our 2 introductory poll questions just to get a better idea of who's here in the room. Get that up on the screen. Give people a couple more seconds to fill out the 2 questions.
Yeah. Nobody else is. So,
All right, thank you all. Okay, Liz.
All right, sorry to jump the gun there. Anyways, I'm really excited to join this today and in general for our long-term collaboration with VAEEC and members like Brenna. Next slide, please. Yeah, you can keep going, Jessica. I think I covered that. Next. Okay, so we're here to talk about the Local Government High Performance Building Act, and we wanted to give a little of the backstory of how this came to be. So Virginia's actually had a High Performance Building Act since 2012, so about a decade, and that applied to state government projects. A newish legislator, Delegate Helmer, decided in late 2020 to introduce a new bill and make some changes to that state requirements, as well as to add a parallel requirement for localities. So that was introduced, and if you've heard the term, a sausage factory to describe Congress or legislation where things come in and a lot of stuff gets done and it comes out, it was a little bit more like a microwave. Like, it came out, was introduced, we all collaborated very quickly and met with the delegate and came up with some improvements and recommendations. And then there were a couple committees, passed one chamber, and then sat, and then all of a sudden it passed. I mean, it was not super deliberative, I guess I'll say. So we did have some input and had some changes made, but not everything that we wanted. So that's part of why we're here today. The goal of the act and its expansion for localities is, recognizing the growth in green building practices, and really to drive better, more efficient, resilient, and future-proof buildings across the Commonwealth, and to bring that performance element into more public buildings. I think that was Delegate Helmer's goal. Next, please. So I'm going to give an overview and then talk about the key requirements in the legislation. Brenna will go into more detail about how you actually approach those. So I think it's a good tag team here. So as I mentioned, the state building program already existed and a couple things were added. And then this new local building program was added. This is now Virginia Code Section 15.2.1804.1. And one notable thing there is that it's not embedded within the code section that deals with the state program. So even though it was in the same session law, this is not really like attached to the state high performance building program, and therefore the Department of General Services, for example, doesn't have responsibility really for the locality program. It's just its own standalone requirement in the section of statute dealing with localities. Next, please. So we wanted to first clarify some of the language because there are some terms that get a little bit confusing. So in the Virginia statute, one term is used, high performance building certification program. And this is defined to mean a public design, construction, and renovation program that achieves certification using LEED or Green Globes or meets the requirement of BEAS. Get to in a second. There's also the term high performance standard, building standard, the standard, and where this word standard is used, this is referring to a section of the statute that means meeting that certification program plus several additional requirements. And we'll go over that in a minute. VEAS is the Virginia Energy Conservation and Environmental Standards, which are a set of standards developed by DGS and which have been recently updated last year. So in contrast, there's a similar term that's in general usage and certainly in the energy policy world, building performance standards or building energy performance standards, often called BEPS or BPS, as we all love our acronyms and shortening. And these are different. This is outcome-based policies in laws that are aimed at reducing the carbon or energy impact of buildings by requiring existing buildings to meet energy limits. And those are regulatory outcomes, and so it's just a different animal. So that would be, I don't know, like, and for those that aren't familiar with building performance standards, in this term, it really is like, a limit to the energy use intensity that all larger buildings have to meet. So you would do your benchmarking, and then after a few years or so, and phased in over time, you would actually have to achieve a certain amount of efficiency based on your annual energy use and other factors. So that is not covered in this law, but because of the performance standard language, we wanted to just clarify because there is a lot of confusion. So we're talking about the high performance standard in Virginia under the Virginia High Performance Buildings Act, which is green building certification plus some additional requirements. So hope that makes sense. So here's just an excerpt from the statute, and you can see here the definition for the certification program there. And then down at the bottom, that section B is where the standard comes into play, and it has 4 elements. So good, coming up. Yeah, so here's where there are building performance standards. It is becoming a more well used and a policy of interest to a lot of jurisdictions that are trying to meet those carbon goals. There are going to be some challenges in doing this specifically in Virginia, and that's another legislative goal of some of us that we'll be working on in the future to enable that in Virginia. Next. Okay. All right. So back to HB 2001. As I mentioned, there's 4 parts to the standard. So first, the green building requirement, that's LEED, Green Globes, or the VEAS, meeting the VEAS standards. Secondly, zero emission vehicle charging and fueling infrastructure. Third, metering of all utilities. And fourth, resilience and distributed energy features. So when you think about what is the standard, what is required, you really have to think of the 4 things. So even though 2, 3, and 4 may be met by how you apply your green building system. You do have to make sure you are meeting them. Next, please. So this applies for the localities, all new buildings over 5,000 square feet, and renovations where the cost of the renovation exceeds 50% of the value of the building. So that's a local determination. The trigger is when you begin design phase, and the design phase includes budget approval and issuing an RFP. So it's the intent there was not to try to mess up projects that were already started and add a new requirement. So anything that's new that you are getting, your county supervisors approving a budget or issuing the design RFP, that's the beginning. So this is already in place for larger Virginia localities with population over 100,000, and it will go into place next July 1st, 2023 for the remaining localities. The law also provides an Energy Star certification option for smaller projects. And so, excuse me, that would be projects that are less than 20,000 gross square feet in size. And people are probably most familiar with Energy Star as far as products, but there's an Energy Star building certification as well for new construction. So this would be ensuring that Energy Star certification for the building is achieved, as well as implementing full commissioning of the building. So that's a different option. And there's also an exemption available. The law provides the governing body of the locality to grant an exemption. It must be in a resolution, and there must be a written finding that special circumstances make meeting the standards impracticable. If cost is the main reason or part of the reason, the locality has to compare the long-term cost of the building if it complies with the building that does not comply, as proposed. And that's over 20 years or the life cycle of the building, which is longer. And that's really to help localities understand that these high performance green buildings and measures are life cycle cost effective. And sometimes there's a lot of focus on first cost, but if a locality balks at the requirement or thinks it's challenging, perhaps going through this analysis might help it see how it can be actually helpful to the locality long term. I think that's the reasoning behind this, the pieces of the exemption. And there's many folks out there who are experienced in green building and building certifications, and often talk about that life cycle cost effectiveness and payback time. It's often much shorter than people imagine it would be. And one reason is that green building has an integrated process, and as you bring together all of the designers and contractor and builders together in the very beginning, you can just make decisions that help one part of the building or one set of systems support other goals and systems so that they make sense, and you don't have redesign or change orders in the field, which can be very costly, but that it's really has a clear intent and priority from the beginning. Brenna can talk a lot more about that. Okay, so going into those four, remember there's the four pieces that make up the standard. So the first is green building that we've talked about, and Brenna will explain some more. Go to the next one. And here's just an example. This was a Virginia Beach project. It looks beautiful. Look at that sky. And this shows the LEED scorecard. So, shows the different categories of outcomes from energy and water to sustainable sites and indoor environmental quality, and the different points that were achieved under each of those categories. And that wraps up to give the certification level. So one example. And I should say, there are many certified local government projects across Virginia already as good case studies and examples. Okay, the second piece of the standard is the zero emission vehicle charging and fueling requirement. And I gave this the first place for being confusing. And Brenna's gonna try to explain it and walk through it. But there are multiple ways to apply this and even potentially to interpret it. Not the cleanest written legislative language, unfortunately. But there seem to be at least 3 or maybe 4 ways to meet it. So first, providing capacity either like EV ready or actually the chargers to support the passenger vehicles that the locality will have at this building when it's at full occupancy. Or secondly, to meet the projected demand in the first 10 years of building occupancy, or to meet the underlying credit of whatever green building program is used. So that, and that itself is several different options. So, so we'll hear a little bit more about that from Brenna. But this is definitely the one that there's been a lot of questions about what people have to do. Metering, thankfully, fairly straightforward, measuring the building's energy consumption, being able to turn that into carbon emissions associated with energy calculation, including electricity, gas, water, and other utilities. And then lastly, the fourth prong is the resilience and distributed energy piece. And I gave this the Crystal Ball Award, but it's really not, I realize it's not quite right, because it should ideally be science and judgment, and I didn't have a good icon for that. But it is perhaps somewhat subjective in terms, it is a local determination to decide which of these features are appropriate for a given project and how far you want to go. So there's not a clear requirement in terms of what level of resilience or a certain like threshold of how much on-site energy you may have to provide. These are recommendations that we would make is to assess the hazards, whether that's sea level rise, which is affecting coastal Virginia, high wind, even heat and heat island issues, and decide what's the role of this building in your community, and decide to provide the features that make sense for that role and those hazards. I think this is a great opportunity for localities to get some of those features that might otherwise be value engineered out, or people might not understand why they're needed, or they seem, too expensive. But really, if you match the hazards and your use to goals that are going to give back to the community, I think people will understand that. Next. So here's some examples of resilient features. Certainly renewable energy and storage can allow a building to continue operating. That might be really important for an emergency operations center, or it could be a community center that does double duty as a shelter in certain types of storms or emergencies. Elevating systems above the flood level, and that should be the predicted flood level, not the historical flood level. Integrating with the grid to enable reducing your peak demand, and that can help reduce the risk of brownouts, especially if that's done at scale over time. But the local building can try to demonstrate that and how that works. Of course, everything starts with efficiency, so you want to use the least power possible in the first place. And then things like rainwater capture can also help provide some potable water or sanitation water in an extended emergency and outage. So the law also provides for localities to have their own program. Such a program, for example, prior to this law, a number of counties and cities already did have some green building programs, some quite stringent. This law requires that any local program be adopted by ordinance specifically versus another policy form, and it must include standards more stringent than the law's requirements. So because of those, like the 2, 3, and 4 piece of the standard, those are things to pay attention to, even if your locality has a green building certification policy of some sort. Next, please. And Sia is on, Maggie Kelly is on. Sia is going to be offering technical assistance very soon on policy creation and stakeholder engagement on, I think, building and energy policy. I think she can speak more to some of the topics that they'll be able to cover and support localities with.
Yeah, Liz, I can definitely, you want me to share that now?
Sure.
Yeah, so at SEIA, the Southeast Energy Efficiency Alliance, we serve 16 states and territories around building codes and standards, and Virginia being one of them. And so we have specific funding through the national labs and DOE to support that work for state and local governments, and as well as territory governments. And so what we have and what we're going to be doing starting the federal fiscal year, October 1st, is really focusing on making sure that cities, jurisdictions, states that want to do anything around benchmarking or building performance standards has a technical assistance that you need for policy creation, stakeholder engagement, kind of really going through the process of creating a standard if that's where you are. And then if you already are in a place, I know that we were looking at having the city of Orlando was on your map earlier, Liz. They have a building performance standard that they've already kind of worked through and done some stakeholder engagement, but the actual implementation is difficult of like, what kind of tools do you use? They're expensive. What does this look like? And so we have a partnership with NEEP, the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnership, the Northeast sister organization to SEIA, and Clearly Energy, that have this BEAM tool. It's based off of the seed data from DOE and Energy Star Portfolio Manager to actually create not only, the transparent pieces of what the building data is, but it has communication tools, et cetera. And so we are funded to actually help people evaluate if the BEAM tool is right for them and then provide technical assistance and support if that is the case. And that, I think, comes free access for a year. When SEIA is a part of that process for BEAM. And so that's just a little bit of what we're doing. I'll say too, we are, and you all will be the first to officially hear this, but we are restarting the Southeast, what used to be the Southeast Codes Coalition. It existed back in 2014, but we are renaming it the Southeast Standards Coalition. And so it'll be codes and standards, work for jurisdictions, states, interested parties throughout the Southeast who are interested in collaborating, connecting, and convening around supporting each other to see more building energy efficiency policy hit the road and go from paper to practice in their jurisdiction. So that's what SEIA offers, and of course it is free of charge. We are funded through the federal government to offer that to you all.
Very exciting. Thanks, Maggie. Okay, and we have some other resources that we've worked on that are, I think, on the AEEC local government page for members, and we can also share those out. Also want to just briefly mention, and I need to turn it over to Brenda and not eat into her time, but that we have on our website, we can share in the follow-up a slide deck that goes through some of the buildings programs within the newly passed Inflation Reduction Act. And that includes a number of funding programs that will could be used to help local government buildings through efficiency, through on-site renewable and storage, and EV charging as well. So we'll try to come up with a way to get that out to you too. So there are some resources coming. All right, and I think we're going to go right over to Brenda, maybe given the time, and we can take questions as they come up later. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Liz. That was a great overview. And we're going to jump into the second part of the presentation. And I'm going to try to build on that information and go into just a little more detail on how to incorporate the various provisions of the law into the workflow of local government and K-12 school projects, which is what I do in my day-to-day life. So if we want to jump to the next slide. First, you have to hear things a couple of times. So I'm going to offer a quick recap on the 4 parts of the legislation as they apply specifically to local government and K-12 school buildings. First, they need to be certified or verified to be a high performance building as they are defined by the Act. And Liz did a great job of defining that for us. They also must include sufficient electric vehicle charging infrastructure, again, as defined by the Act. And Liz did a good job of priming you for, we're going to talk about that a little bit more. They also must be able to measure energy consumption so that associated carbon emissions must be calculated. And that piece is pretty straightforward. And then buildings must incorporate resilience, appropriate resilience, and distributed energy features. So let's talk about how we're going to accomplish all of that. So really quickly about my slides. Some of my slides have a lot of words, and I apologize for that, but I wanted to copy the actual text of the legislation into the slides so you can see exactly which sections I'm speaking about. And if you want to go to the legislation later, if you're so inclined to do that, you can use the find feature and jump right to the specific language of interest. And since you're going to have a copy of these slides, you won't have to read all these words right now. And you can just focus on the tips that I'm providing. So the first piece I wanted to talk about before you dive into which pathway you're going to follow is check your building size. We know that if your building is smaller than 5,000 square feet, the Act does not apply. But if your building is smaller than 20,000 square feet, there is also that off-ramp that Liz mentioned. And you would have the option to pursue Energy Star certification. And what that means, if you have a property type that's eligible for Energy Star certification, is in the design and construction phase, you would need to ask your design team to pursue that designed to earn the Energy Star designation. That would be the applicable or the relevant Energy Star certification at that phase. You also don't want to forget about that part 2, the implementing the mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and envelope commissioning. Envelope commissioning is a little bit newer onto the scene, and you don't want to forget that piece when you're putting out your RFP to hire your commissioning services. That envelope commissioning would apply to these smaller projects. I also put a tip on there that not all property types are eligible for Energy Star certification. When you get the slides, hopefully that link will still be live. You can link right to the Energy Star website and take a look and see which property types are eligible and which are not. If you have a smaller building that is not eligible to earn the Energy Star, you can work with your designer to see if you can still benchmark to Energy Star, or you might have to get back on an on-ramp and follow the more traditional, LEED or Green Globes or V's pathway. So you'll want to think about that first. Then on the next slide, we will also want to examine whether or not your local jurisdiction has its own green building ordinance. The first tip I have there is if you're in a jurisdiction that has no policy, you'll want to continue to follow the High Performance Building Act because that will govern. You might be in a jurisdiction that already has a policy, and you might have to follow a compliance path that requires a higher certification level than the High Performance Buildings Act. But you're also going to want to look to make sure that your ordinance, as Liz pointed out, covers the other requirements in the standard outside of just LEED, Green Globes, or Vs. And then some jurisdictions might have a policy that states a compliance path with a higher certification level and also addresses specific credits that must be earned. So you're going to want to go and look and see what's going on in your particular jurisdiction and what your requirements are. So once you've cleared those hurdles, then we can jump in to the part of the legislation that makes you choose one of 3 high performance building certification programs. So if we want to jump to the next slide, those programs are LEED, Green Globes, or the requirements of the Virginia Energy Conservation and Environmental Standards, and that's what we all refer to as Vs. So the Vs is currently an adapted version of the 2018 International Green Construction Code. All 3 of these programs are pretty similar in that they all deal with high performance buildings. They all do it in a robust whole building approach. That's different from that Energy Star off-ramp, which really just deals with energy. These 3 all deal with the whole building. So they deal with all the same issues. Not exclusively, there's some differences when you get into the weeds, but in terms of big picture thinking, they're all gonna, basically address things like building location, site development, water conservation, energy efficiency, material selection, and indoor environmental quality. But they start to differ in terms of how they define and measure success within those larger buckets. And, those definitions vary from system to system. Probably one of the biggest differences in each program is their philosophical approach to keeping score, and that's what this slide is trying to summarize for you. The IGCC, for example, that's written as code language, so everything in it is mandatory. You do not get to pick and choose what you do. LEED, that's a mix of prerequisites and optional points. So there are things that you have to do. If you don't do them, you cannot certify no matter how many points you earn. And then there's a lot of things from which you can pick and choose based on your environmental priorities and your cost constraints for your specific project. So you put together your own green building roadmap for the most part, but all LEED buildings share some commonalities, which are, those are the prerequisites. And then Green Globes has no prerequisites. You build your own sustainability roadmap without any mandatory requirements at all. So if we jump to the next slide, I've broken out some more of the details associated with each of the 3 pathways on this slide. So in Virginia, we kind of use the IGCC interchangeably with Vs, I think, when we're, not being quite as formal, but they're not exactly the same thing. The Vs has some additional requirements outside of the IGCC language. But when we're talking about this act, we are going to, the act requires that everything in chapters 5 through 11 is complied with in terms of the IGCC. So all of those things are mandatory. DEB has amended some of the requirements in chapters 5 through 11. So you'll have to look at the CPSM for those amendments, and the extra mandatory requirements of the Vs are also in the CPSM. So you want to go to Appendix V to find all of those changes. The IGCC, as I said, it's written as code. Compliance is reviewed by the Division of Engineering and Buildings, DEB. So that's part of the Department of General Services. I'm going to have another slide after this one that summarizes what those additional mandatory provisions are of the Vs, if you're interested in pursuing that particular compliance path. In terms of LEED, the act is going to be considered satisfied by earning LEED certified. So to earn that level of certification, you have to comply with all of the prerequisites in the rating system. And that would be in the applicable rating system, because they have different rating systems for different building types: LEED for new construction, LEED for schools, LEED for core and shell, LEED for commercial interiors, and so forth. then you have to earn a minimum of 40 of the 100 optional points. And in fact, there's actually 110 optional points because there are 10 bonus points that you can pick and choose from, but projects are going to be scored on that scale of 100. So LEED is written as a voluntary certification program. It has a pretty robust set of supplementary reference material. Some of that reference material is free, some of it is available at a cost. And then the USGBC also provides user support for teams that are trying to navigate that system. Certification is going to be earned after review by a sister organization called the GBCI. And you're going to pay a cost for registering a project, and that is simply, setting up your intent to certify down the road. And then there's an additional cost when you actually submit for your certification as you go through that certification process. And then finally, Green Globes certification at the 1 globe level satisfies the Act. So to earn that level of certification, a project has to comply with 35% of the optional 1,000 points available. In Green Globes, they'll let you say certain points. If it's not applicable to your project, you just strike it from the rating system. So not all projects are scored on 1,000 points. Your project might be scored on 985 or 950 points if some of those points aren't applicable. So that's why they score it on a percentage basis. Like LEED, Green Globes is written as a voluntary certification program. It also has supplementary reference material available to teams. The GBI provides user support for teams navigating that system. Certification is earned from the GBI after a documentation review and a site visit by a Green Globes assessor. And also, like LEED, there's going to be a cost for registering the project with the intent to certify, and then costs associated for actually completing the certification process. So if we jump to the next slide, I'd mentioned that if a project wanted to go through the V's pathway, there's going to be some additional mandatory provisions that were added in specific to V's. So this is a summary of those provisions here. The section numbers I have here are from within the IGCC. These are not sections from the High Performance Building Act. We keep talking about electric vehicle charging stations. That first mandatory provision was added into the V's via the CPSM. If you're a state agency, you have to comply with CPSM Appendix G. It appears that if you choose the V's pathway, if you're a local government or K-12 school, you would also then have to follow the CPSM Appendix G, is what it looks like you would have to do. There's some other requirements too in terms of forms that you have to fill out if you follow the V's pathway, some energy reporting forms and some checklists and things. And then you also are supposed to submit an annual report to the governor, technically, if you follow the V's pathway. And that's part of the state requirements. If you go to the next slide, in terms of how each of the 3 compliance pathways are measured for success, there's some differences there too. If you're using the V's, the IGCC, since it's written like code, you've either passed it or you failed it. You either successfully implement everything in the code or you do not. And you really have to do everything, so you need to pass. LEED follows more of an Olympics for green buildings approach. There's a base level of certification, which is what's required for the Act. And then you have the option to strive for higher levels of certification at the silver, gold, or platinum levels. And some local jurisdictions may have ordinances that already require some of those higher levels. And then Green Globes awards more globes for higher levels of achievement. You start with the 1 globe level, that's what's required for the Act. And then at higher levels, you get 2, 3, and 4 globes. You quickly notice that the breakpoints between LEED and Green Globes, they're not the same. Certified is a higher percentage of overall points than 1 globe, but then silver is a lower percentage of overall points than 2 globes. But then you can't really compare percentages of points because that doesn't take into account the prerequisites that LEED includes, and they're not included in the point count. And so you really quickly see that the 3 systems, they're hard to compare apples to apples. even if they do address similar topics. So if we go back, or if we go forward to the next slide, we're going to circle back to electric vehicle charging stations. So this is something that's addressed specifically in the Act. They have the statement that, you know, any building that has to comply with the Act, so it's more than 5,000 square feet, it has to have sufficient ZEV charging and fueling infrastructure. But what does that really mean? I mean, I think that's a really good question because it's defined a lot of different ways. I don't know that I can actually answer it definitively for you, but what I'm going to try to do is walk you through some of the definitions I've identified and some of the different compliance paths. But, you know, my main tip is the high performance building certification program you choose may influence how you comply with that mandatory provision. So we'll jump to the next slide. I have a couple slides about this. So in the Act yourself, there was the language in the first bullet that says, you know, every project must have charging infrastructure, including the EV ready capacity and pre-wiring sufficient to support every passenger type vehicle owned by the locality that will be located at the building when the building is at full capacity, and must meet projected demand for infrastructure during the first 10 years following occupancy. So if you're a building that doesn't, you know, keep fleet vehicles, that is not a big ask. But if you are a building that does keep fleet vehicles, that could be a very big ask. But there's an or clause. So the or clause says you can also achieve the current ZEV or EV charging credit for the high performance building certification program that you're following. So if you off-ramped to Energy Star, I think you have to follow the first bullet. And if you didn't off-ramp to Energy Star, then you can follow whatever certification program you've decided to follow. So on the next slide, I've broken that down a little bit in more detail. So if you followed the V's pathway, I have already said, I think you have to follow CPSM Appendix G, but in the IGCC itself, there are different requirements that were stricken in the V's, but the IGCC says 2 or more EV charging stations need to be available to building occupants and need to be located not more than a quarter mile from the project, or you need to provide electrical raceways. If you're going to follow LEED, there are a couple different options there. You can pick between the LEED version 4 requirements. Those include both designated spaces for low emitting and fuel efficient vehicles and providing electric vehicle charging stations. Or you have the option to upgrade to version 4.1 requirements. And those version 4.1 requirements drop the low emitting fuel efficient spaces. And then they let you pick either between installing more electric vehicle charging stations, so that would be 5% of your spaces, or making even more spaces EV ready. So you could make 10% of your spaces EV ready. So you have a fair number of options if you go with LEED. That's 3 options there. And then if you're certifying to green globes, this one doesn't really move the needle too far, and it doesn't really seem to meet the spirit of the Act, but the credit in green globe says the project needs to confirm that there are alternative refueling facilities or EV charging stations somewhere within a quarter mile of the site. It doesn't seem to require that the facilities are available to the users of the site, but I would hope and think that the assessor would at least be checking for that. So I'm done talking about EV charging stations. There's one more requirement in the standard. It says we have to have appropriate resilience and distributed energy features. This is definitely a nod to where the future of sustainable design is headed. But in the Act right now, it comes without a whole lot of guidance. So I really like the graphic that Liz shared, and that starts to speak to these issues. In terms of project workflow, I cannot emphasize this enough. Please start thinking about these things early, you know, schematic design early, RFP early, even when you are deciding on where the project site is going to be. So some of the most important things that you can do to set up a project for success includes working with your team to understand and clarify the hazards that understand the hazards that your site, might be looking at, and then also understand the project's vulnerability to those hazards so that the design can be responsive to those concerns. This definitely should not be an afterthought. It should be baked into the concept of the design. And then as owners, it's going to be important to communicate the importance of energy efficiency in the project design. So, kind of moving from resilience to distributed energy. If you can communicate the importance of that energy efficiency piece, it's going to save you money for the life of the building. And then it will also make any future renewable energy you add less expensive when you look at the ratio between how much of your building those renewables can power. So the other piece to that is, do some PV master planning now so that you can work out a data-driven strategy for installation priorities and then a solid financing plan over time. So I'm going to leave you with some final tips for success, my final thoughts. I really just want to emphasize a few things. To maximize your success with this act and to really maximize your success with a high performance building, because that's the goal here is to maximize your success with high performance building. Clarify those design priorities and goals in the RFP, in your owner's project requirements. That is, really of paramount importance. Include the topics from the act, include topics about EV infrastructure, metering, renewable energy, resilience, and anything else that's of particular importance to your jurisdiction. Include those things in the RFP and the OPR. As the project kicks off, insist on an integrative high performance strategy session and then follow up on those topics regularly. Getting all the disciplines together to get all the issues on the table early is going to save you time and money. Another thing that's going to save time and money is confirming which High Performance Buildings Act pathway a project is going to take, making that decision during schematic design. So that's something that might be worth discussing with the selected design team. So it doesn't necessarily have to be done in advance of hiring the team, but it should really be done before any meaningful design work is undertaken. And then finally, once a decision is made, stay the course. Hopefully I've helped you peek behind the curtain enough to show that, while the systems are familiar, they're not interchangeable. Switching mid-project can be costly, it can be confusing, and from my perspective, it's really not recommended except in the most dire of circumstances. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jessica, and hopefully she can get us sorted into our breakouts after she asks us a couple more poll questions.
Thank you, Liz and Brenna. We're also going to just open it up for general questions right now. After hearing Liz and Brenna's presentations, if you have any questions, please submit them in the chat box. And I did see that one came through, just to make sure everyone is able to see that. Liz, I know you answered it, but we'll do it again over audio. Who is the enforcement agent for this code?
Yeah, so as I was saying earlier in the beginning, this locality section is not really attached, like in law, to the state building section. So DGS and other agencies do not have a clear role, and that's kind of come up repeatedly as people have questions about interpretation. There's no one really to go to. There's a couple things we've talked about. If a particular locality has a burning question and they're able to get attention of their city or county attorney, that individual can actually submit it to, I think there's a office in the legislature, there's a particular office that actually can provide interpretations, but only for local government directly. And that would be a specific question. But as far as like general advice, compliance training, or oversight, that doesn't exist. And one of the reasons we're having these webinars this week is to get ideas about what people see as areas for improvement in these programs. You know, we've talked a bit about some of the complexity and getting in the weeds, but you know, really it is an opportunity for higher performing, more resilient buildings that will add value to your communities. I mean, I think that was the original intent, and to bring more focus on performance. But are there ways that if we're able to advocate for some tweaks to the laws that could make that either easier or more effective? So one of those was, you know, perhaps we seek to have the law amended to provide a role in technical assistance for the Virginia Department of Energy, or something like that. And maybe there's some, I don't know, if there would be reporting or some kind of compliance, even like localities would put their work under the statute on either in one of their public meetings once a year, or have it on their website, just so that interested citizens could see what was going on with respect to it. But there's, you know, this is like a dialogue, so we're interested in people's thoughts about that too.
Thanks, Liz. I'll give people a chance to add any lingering questions into the chat box, but I will go ahead and bring up our second round of poll questions, hopefully. Well, we're having some technical difficulties with those poll questions, so we'll just skip right through those. Apologies for that. All right, so this is the part of the event where we're going to self-select into 3 different breakout rooms. So you get to pick which one you want to go into based on the topic. In room 1, it'll be general legislation overview. So if you do want to go into an even deeper dive into what the legislation or the act mandates, what it says, if you have any questions, go to room number 1. For developing a green building policy in general, go to room number 2. And then room number 3 will be local, regional, or statewide green building priorities. Once I open up the rooms, you'll see room 1, 2, and 3 pop up. If you go into a room, decide you want to give another one a try, you can either leave or hit breakout rooms again in the toolbar at the bottom, and then that'll give you the opportunity to switch into another room. We'll have about 20 to 30 minutes, depending on how the conversations are flowing, before we come back together into this room. I will go ahead and pull those up, and I will stay out in this main room. So if you have any troubleshooting issues, I can try to help you get through them.